Or do we? Me and Kevin went and saw Brother Reeve this afternoon.
He got to come back home.
He's at home. Yep, he is. They're going to start him on hospice, or he'll get it started tomorrow. So they told him that his option was dialysis 3 days a week or hospice, and he told him he'd take the hospice. So, but he's in good spirits. And Josh and Jason are home now. I think both of the Robins are coming tomorrow, and Josh is going to work. I don't know. They've got it all worked out where they're going to be around. So, yeah. There she is. Y'all make her a spot. Revelation 14, verses 6 to 13. Yeah. Alrighty. Any other prayer requests? I'm glad you're back in my room tonight. I missed you this morning. That's right. That's right. All right. If not, let me open us in a word of prayer. Gracious God, thank you for this day. Thank you for this time we have to study your word. Lord, thank you for these who are dedicated to the study of your word, who have returned again tonight. And Lord, I just pray that you bless the study, bless our efforts as we come to your word and try to better understand it and to learn more and to grow in the knowledge and grace of you, Lord. And it's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen. All right, so we are picking up now Revelation chapter 14, verse 14, and we're going to finish out chapter 14, going all the way through verse 20. Finally, it's taken us 3 weeks to get through this, but we're going to finish chapter 14. I was looking at it this afternoon, and there is a very small growing possibility that we'll be done with Revelation by Christmas. A small but growing possibility. So I kind of think already where I want to go after that. It's a little scary. It never has that easy, but we'll see. I've got to get through this first. So Revelation 14, let's start with verse 14. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over the fire. And he called with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, Put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grape harvest of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. So what we're sort of dealing with right off are these two agricultural images, which, I mean, they're pretty straightforward. They kind of ask us to know something about ancient Near Eastern agricultural practices, but not too much. They're coming on the heels of those three angels that we saw last week. And so those three angels, remember, really declared the doom of those who were in Rome, those who had gone along with emperor worship and all of that sort of stuff. And then at the end, we had that really wonderful picture. I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them." And so it's this really helpful, I think, picture of the hope that we have, not only as Christians, but also the hope that we have for fellow Christians who die and are taken into the Lord, because their good deeds go with them as well. So these two images now that we come up to, the grain harvest and the vineyard harvest, or the grape harvest, whatever you want to call it, not super controversial, although the grain harvest kind of is, and we'll talk about it, because the issue is, does John mean by the grain harvest a gathering of the saints? Or is this the first of two pictures of judgment, so that you have sort of the gathering in the grain harvest, and then you have the judgment in the vineyard harvest? I think one of the things that would help us with this is if our chapters happened a little differently. So remember, chapters aren't native to the original manuscripts of the Bible. They came later. And I think, at least thematically, it'd be helpful if these two things, this grain harvest and this vineyard harvest, actually happened at the beginning of chapter 15, because it plays a little game with our head when we think about this being the end of chapter 14. So maybe just kind of don't think about the chapters for a moment.
I'm not sure I understand.
Fine. She says, I'm not sure I understand. Neither am I, Siri, neither am I. So these two visions serve to introduce in reverse order God's coming judgments. So what we're going to see as we go into chapter 15 and we move beyond that, we really get kind of the original tale of two cities. We're going to have chapters 15 to 20 are going to tell us the tale of Rome, what's going to happen to Rome, the judgment that's coming upon Rome. Starting in chapter 12, we've been on this move toward thinking about Rome, and so when we get to chapter 15, we're really going to see a lot of that. The tale of the second city then is going to pick up in chapter 21, and that's the tale of the heavenly Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. And that'll get us chapter 21 and chapters 22. So some of you, this will come as a happy revelation. What we're reading tonight and what we're talking about tonight is setting us up for how we should think about the rest of the book. So we have been kind of taking this thing piece by piece, and now we're really getting into a headspace to take care of the rest of Revelation. I also think that we're going to find that the rest of the book moves a little bit more quickly, because now we're used to what we're about to see coming in Revelation. So we have these two anticipatory pictures of the end of human history in this grain harvest and in this vineyard harvest. These are not two random pictures, but they do have connections to each other and to the book as a whole. Now we're going to spend the majority of our time with the grain harvest image, because it is the one that is the most difficult to understand. I think the vineyard harvest is pretty easy. So here we go. Starting in verse 14, what in the world is John picturing? He says, I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud, one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. He could be picturing pretty much any number of things at this point. The most popular interpretations of these verses is that he is depicting the gathering of the righteous, but there are others who have said that this is the final harvest of the wicked as they await the judgment pictured in the next scene. So it's sort of like, if you take that view, it's sort of like John starts out pretty broadly. We're harvesting the earth, and then in the second thing with the vineyard harvest. I think if the second image wasn't there, board better with the reading of the gathering of the saints. Now, ultimately, I think that is what is being pictured here. But it does raise some questions, because in our interpretation, we have to take into account what is said and what is not said. And what is not said is whether or not we should connect these two ideas. It doesn't, it'd be really helpful if John had said, so he who sat on the cloud, his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Alongside this, and from another angle, another angel came out of the temple in heaven. Like, then we should be reading these things as one unit. But the text doesn't give us that. So how do we interpret it? That's the question here. Now, we do know that in Scripture, a grain harvest is hardly ever a negative picture. If you go back to the Old Testament and you think about the grain harvests in the Old Testament, those are happy times. Grain itself is an image of prosperity and of hopefulness. So you think about Joseph, when Joseph was put in charge of the grain in Egypt, and The famine came, and Joseph's family is the one that goes to him. And if it hadn't been for Joseph's foresight and planning for the famine, there would not have been any grain put up. So famine is itself life-giving, it's prosperity, it's that sort of thing always in the Bible. So on the one hand, we have a really hard time reading the grain harvest as a negative image because it is a grain harvest as opposed to something else. Also, we just don't have an explicit metaphor of judgment. It just says that the earth was reaped. He swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped because, if you read backward, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So whatever the harvest of the earth is supposed to be, it has achieved its fullness, and that is what has happened. But there's no judgment pictured there. So it stands to reason to me that John intended two contrasting images. The first is the gathering of the righteous, and the second is the judgment of the wicked. So verse 14, John looked, and behold, a white cloud, indicating to us that what John is seeing is something above the earth, right? He's not on the earth. He's still outside of it, still translated into heaven. He's been in heaven since chapter 4. And then he says, and seated on the cloud, one like a son of man with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Now, here's what complicates this just a little bit. Son of man is itself a Hebrew idiom that simply means a human person. Now, we know that in the Gospels, Son of Man is primarily a means of self-identification for Jesus. In fact, it's Jesus' preferred way to refer to himself. He does not really like to use Son of God at all. He will say Son of Man. Of course, we know that Son of Man image from Daniel as well. So we sort of have a tension there. But now, if this is John's revelation, then I think it's really helpful to look at John's gospel particularly. And what John says in his gospel is that Son of Man should be applied to Jesus, but it does not appear nearly as frequently in John's gospel as it does in the other gospels, because think about John's gospel. It is the most spiritual Jesus, right? I mean, when we see John's gospel starts, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and that whole eternal image of Jesus before creation. And then John is subsequently focused on the deity of Jesus and establishing over and over again that Jesus is the Son of God. So when we come to Revelation, we kind of can take how John has used Son of Man in his gospel and interpret how he might be using it in Revelation. And in both cases, the emphasis is always on Jesus' humanity, which John does not focus on very much. So, okay, that's all well and good. But then we have this second difficulty. If we want to identify this as Christ, okay, but then we have a second difficulty, because in verse 15, it then says, another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, and said, put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. My question to you is, does the risen Lord take commands from an angel? And so this angel comes out of the temple calling with a loud voice, but it is very weird if this is Jesus, that Jesus is responding to the angel, right? Instead of Jesus being the one calling the shots. But now I'm going to argue with myself, because we have to remember that this is apocalyptic imagery, not narrative history. One of the things that we do regularly when we come to Revelation and we come to Daniel and we come to Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, places that have these big images, is we want to read them as literally as possible. And that works really well until it doesn't. And this is one of those places where actually it doesn't, because if you take the role of angels in Revelation and you look at it carefully, angels either do everything divine, or they set in motion everything that matters. It is the angels who have the 7 trumpets. It is the angels who have the 7 bowls. Jesus is the one who opens the 7 seals, but it's also the angels in heaven that worship. It is the angels in heaven who declare to John, this is who this person is, this is who that one is. I mean, all the mediation of the revelation that's happening is coming by way of angels. All the judgment that's being poured out for the most part is happening by way of angels. So the question of whether or not an angel can give a directive to the risen Son, actually the answer in this context is yes. Not because the angel has more power than the Son, but because the function of angels is to set this stuff in motion. It's part of, if you'll remember back a couple of Christmases ago, we talked about angels. Miss Joyce had asked if I would do a little set on angels, and so I did. And one of the things that we learned about angels there is they are given one of their major roles. They are tasked with administrating the affairs of the earth for God, right, relative to the population on earth. Well, here's an instance of that happening, just in a way that we're not used to thinking about it. We know this is Jesus if we read on, because it says, one like a son of man seated on a cloud with a golden crown on his head. This is not a victor's crown, so he's not some martyr. This is not the kind of crown that we would be given in order to throw back at Jesus' feet because we are victorious. This is a royal crown, right? And the royal crown implies Jesus, because what other royalty exists in heaven apart from Jesus? Nobody. So this is just an apocalyptic way of describing Christ and of describing how these events are unfolding. And then we have this crucial point that he has a sharp sickle in his hand. So it is that this angel comes out of the heavenly temple. Now, we've already seen the heavenly temple back in chapter 11. If you fast forward to Revelation, I can't remember where, if it's 20, 21, or 22. In any case, if you fast forward over there, John will say, and there was no temple, for the Lamb and God were the temple, right? So we don't need a temple in the New Jerusalem, but evidently there is a heavenly temple. And so this angel comes out. Then the rest of the paragraph offers the command, which repeats by way of direct address what has already been said narratively. Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. If you want to follow up on that, he's echoing Joel chapter 3, verse 13 there. Now, don't misunderstand John's language, because the phrases, the hour has come and the harvest is ripe, imply that there is, or might imply that there is a divine schedule of some kind that is now set in motion, but we don't need to mess that up. What it really indicates is there is a finality to all of this. The divine plan has been set in motion from eternity past, right? So we don't need to make the mistake of saying, okay, now it's in effect. No, it's been in effect always. Because to say it starts at any time other than eternity past, before creation, is to say that God had to come up with a plan to solve the issues that are currently facing us. And that's not the message of the Bible at all. It's the same kind of thing, if you'll remember, I think it's Philippians 2, that wonderful passage where Paul is describing the incarnation, and he starts it off, when the fullness of time had come, God took on the form of a bondservant. That whole thing, I'm paraphrasing it badly, but when the fullness of time had come is that Pauline language for this same thing. There was a moment in time in human history when God said, now I will go as Jesus. And so it is also here. The hour has come, the harvest is ripe. There is this moment in time where God says, okay, go get them. Go reap them. The moment in the divine plan has arrived. That's a good way to put that. So we're told that he who sat on the cloud did as he was told. He swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Now, one other thing that I would say to you about this, I didn't put it in my notes, but one other thing that I would say to you about this is when Jesus is asked by the disciples what it is that we should be looking for at the end of the age, and one of Jesus' responses is, no man knows the day nor the hour, not the angels in heaven or even the Son, right? And implying that he doesn't know. Well, of course, in his deity he knows, but in his humanity he does not. And that is the way that John is, that's the side of Jesus that John is playing to here. He is the Son of Man, so he's playing to Jesus' humanity. Another reason why the angel saying, now is the time, go reap, it's another reason why that would work. So, what follows then in verses 17 to 20 with its clear expression of judgment, stands in considerable contrast to what we've seen here with this grain harvest. The grain harvest, I think, is very simply imagery for the gathering of God's own people. But now as we come to these next 3 verses, and I'm going to read them again in just a minute, we should note that this is the opposite side of the same thing, but the emphasis and the focus is on a different group. So let's pick up in verse 17. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven. He too had a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over the fire, and he called with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, "Put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grape harvest of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. So everything about this indicates that it is to be a companion to the prior one. Many scholars say that this is parallel, that these harvests are the same harvest, and the vineyard harvest is just a nuanced variation of the grain harvest. That's not what I'm saying, because that makes the grain harvest more negative than it actually appears in the text. My reading on this is that you have a harvest in which God's people, the righteous, are reaped from the earth. They are taken into their eternal glory. The unrighteous are also reaped from the earth, and they are sent away to their judgment and their punishment. And we'll unpack that a bit more. There is no question at all that this vineyard harvest is about the judgment of God all the way. We have this language already built in here of the wrath of God, the winepress of the wrath of God, right? It's also furthered by the imagery of another angel who has authority over the fire. Now, that's a really obscure thing, the fire of the altar in the heavenly temple. So remember, all these angels are coming out of the temple, right? Probably bringing to mind for us sacrificial images, the grain sacrifice and so forth and so on as well. But this is the angel who then came from the altar and called with a loud voice to the first angel, the one who came out of the temple in heaven. So we got all these angels and it gets kind of confusing. And note that this first angel in verse 17 has a sharp sickle too. And it's very weird, and this is one of the things that throws people for a loop, and I don't know that I have a good answer for it. But one like the Son of Man, who does the gathering of the believers or the gathering of the redeemed, has a sickle in his hand. But when it comes time to reap those from the earth for judgment, it's an angel who has the sickle who does this. And so the second angel commands the first one to put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe. So the second angel obeys the command of the first angel. It's verse 19. And, you know, this is one of those moments where it kind of stretches our imagination a little bit. The angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grape harvest of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. Nothing gathered in the vineyard harvest makes it. Everything that the angel harvests, everything that is reaped in the vineyard harvest gets thrown into the winepress of the wrath of God. Now, our primary source of imagery on this is Isaiah chapter 63, verse 3 and verse 6. And in that passage, Yahweh speaks judgment against the nations. So I want to go there and look just to read it to you. You don't have to turn there. Isaiah 63, verse 3. This is the Lord's day of vengeance, is the header that's given in the ESV. I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. I trod them in my anger and trampled them in my wrath. Their lifeblood spattered on my garments and stained all my apparel. And then verse 6, I trampled down the peoples in my anger. I made them drunk in my wrath, and I poured out their lifeblood on the earth. So, I mean, this is... You hear people talk about the Old Testament God versus the New Testament God. All I'm saying is it must be the same God, because in Revelation, here is Old Testament God back on display, right? What John has done for us is he's given us an image of both. He's given us an image of both sides of God to say this is the same person. Here is the gathering of the redeemed. Here is the judgment of the unredeemed. We also remember the language that John used back in chapter 6, verses 16 to 17. This is the sixth seal. Hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. All right, here it is. Or we might think of the seventh trumpet in chapter 11, verse 18. And the nations raged, but your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged, and for rewarding your servants, and for destroying the destroyers of the earth. Over and over again in Revelation, the gathering and the judgment and the reward are all one event. The time has come for your servants to be rewarded and the destroyers of the earth to be destroyed. Again, we have these two images, the gathering of the redeemed versus the gathering of the unredeemed. Finally, the reader is told that the grapes were trampled in the winepress outside the city. Now, the two questions that emerge are, what city? And who does the trampling? Of course, now if the image from Isaiah is there for our usefulness, and I think it is, God is the one doing the trampling outside the city. I think in John's mind, the city is Rome. Now, again, we have to read Revelation carefully because even in John's mind, it had relevance for his present situation. And John's present situation was dealing with the oppression of the Roman Empire. That doesn't mean that it stops at relevance with Rome. I think it has relevance until God calls the curtain, right? But for John, in his mind at least, the city was Rome. And we're going to see that played out in chapters 15 to 18, particularly because John's going to talk a lot about Rome, very specifically in chapters 15 to 18. And so the gruesome nature of the judgment is expressed finally. Now, Revelation has been tiptoeing all around this for the previous parts of the book, and now all at once, finally, the judgment is referred to in the terms of shedding of blood. And that's what it says for us right there at the end. Their blood flowed from the winepress, that's verse 20, with such a quantity that it rose as high as a horse's bridle, for 1,600 stadia. Now, those two measurements are not the same, unless that's a really tall horse, because 1,600 stadia for us in America is about 180 miles high. It's 300 kilometers if you want to use communist unit. No, I'm kidding. But if you're in kilometers, whatever, it's 300 kilometers. But 180 miles high. Anybody? I'm really horrible at anything to do with maps, but
I think that's like twice as far as driving to Jackson.
yeah. I mean, you're just just blood and blood and blood. That is the enormity of God's judgment on Rome whenever it takes place. Again, John's mind, Rome. And I think the reason he sets this up, I told you that he gives us this in the inverse. That we have the gathering of the redeemed, which actually has to do with the New Jerusalem at the end of Revelation, 20 to 22. And that you have the vineyard harvest, which has to do with the wicked city of Rome, which he's going to talk about starting in verse 15. And I think that's why he keeps all of that judgment together, right? He basically kind of throws us a little bit of a bone, and he says, if you are in the redeemed, hold on. It'll be all right. But if you're not, get ready. Get ready. Because what we're about to see are the bowls of God's wrath. And the bowls don't stop. When we studied the trumpets and we studied the seals, we had these nice, helpful little interludes. They kind of gave us a minute to breathe. You're not going to find that with the bowls. The bowls are one right behind the other. And as we go through the bowls, there's going to be this common refrain of they did not repent and give him glory. Now, in the trumpets, there was a thought that repentance was on the table. Nobody took it, but it was on the table. Now you come to the bowls, and it's almost, doesn't quite say that it's not there, but it effectively says they did not repent. They're not going to. It never entered their mind. As bad as it is, they're still not giving it up. Well, why are they not giving it up? Because they have accepted the mark of the beast. So what we have now at the end, now that we've finished chapter 14, we've wrapped up this section that John started in chapter 12. We got ourselves a nice little break that had to do with the woman and the dragon, and Satan's thrown down to earth, the first beast, the second beast, the lamb and the 144,000, the messages of the three angels, the harvests of the earth. I mean, what John does in 12 through 14 is really kind of interesting, because it's sort of like he restates everything that he's already said in other parts of Revelation, but he just kind of puts it together and really condenses it. And so I told you when we started Revelation that Revelation is basically the same set of images, but you see them from different perspectives as you go. So by the time you get done with Revelation, you have a full picture of what's happening. This is one of those things where John takes it and he gives you a different angle on it. All right, and so we have finished that, and now we're coming with the 7 plagues and the 7 bowls. All of this that we have looked at is very much at the center of John's story, and it gives us the theological and prophetic heart of Revelation. Because central to all of this, I mean, we can say what we want to about the fate of the church, whatever your opinions are on the rapture and when that happens and all that, at the end of the day, John does have something to say for the church here. John also has something to say for the unredeemed and the unrepentant here. But at the heart of the whole thing is the gospel. John never leaves that out. We don't need to miss it, getting all wrapped up in the details of the plagues and the trumpets and the whole 9 yards. For John, central to everything is Jesus and his defeat of Satan. And he sees that defeat of Satan in 2 ways. Historically, it happens through the resurrection of Jesus. And then in the future, it will happen again at the end through the resurrection of the believers and the final destruction of all that is evil. But with that hope and with that central focus, John is not immune to or ignorant of the fact that hard times are ahead for those who persevere for the sake of the gospel. You'll note that every time we get one of these sort of scene shifts and camera pullaways to go look at the church, we're talking about martyrdom. We're talking about here is a call for the endurance of the saints, or a call for the perseverance of the saints. Because John is aware, just because you're playing Team Jesus while all of this is going on doesn't mean that you're not going to suffer. You're not suffering God's wrath, because God's wrath is exacted on those who have not believed in Jesus. But you will suffer at the hands of those who are being punished by God's wrath. And, you know, we can say, well, that's just sort of a, I don't know, what do you want to call it? It's basically just me trying to equivocate on the same thing. But it's not. If we try to witness to somebody in Walmart and they laugh at us and walk off and then go home and post about this idiot that they met in Walmart on Facebook, do we blame God for that? No. We walk away from it and we say, I did what I was supposed to do for God. Well, in the same way in Revelation, we need not say that just because the church is persecuted by the people that God is punishing, that God is in effect also punishing the church. He's not. Because they have the decision and the free will to do that, and they choose to do it. So even though God will finally save his own and judge the enemy, the present and the near future is not going to be a bed of roses. But he says God's people must continue to bear witness to the nation. They have to continually be warned and warning about the maddening adulteries of the enemy, and they need to be prepared to suffer and die as part of their witness. So what we've looked at tonight, again, just to reiterate, is best seen as an introduction to the two major parts of the rest of the book. It's going to be Rome, the evil city, and it's going to be the New Jerusalem, the heavenly perfect city. And that's the two major things we have left. And so this grain harvest image comes first as an encouragement to God's suffering people and anticipates that narrative in chapter 21 that runs all the way through 22, while the trampling of the grapes anticipates what lies next in chapters 15 to 20. So, as I said, we'll proceed through the rest of Revelation, I think, reasonably quickly. Chapter 17 and chapter 18 will take us a few weeks apiece. But we're getting there, and I think hopefully by the end of this, a lot of what I've been saying that y'all have been like, I don't know what Ian's on about over there, but he's wrong. Hopefully you'll at least say, well, I don't agree with him, but it is based in the Bible. That's my hope, because I recognize that Revelation is over-interpreted. Everybody has their opinion and nobody agrees. So anyway, questions or comments about any of that? All right, we're done a few minutes early tonight, but Miss Joyce, will you dismiss us tonight?